Okay, in this video we're going to talk about polynomials, and here's an example of a polynomial. Now, all polynomials have terms. Let's list the terms in this polynomial. The first term is 3x cubed. The next term is 4x to the fifth. The next term has a negative in front of it, so it's considered to be a negative term. It's negative 2x squared. The next term is negative 5. And the last term in that polynomial is x. Every single term here comes with a coefficient. The coefficient of the first term is 3. The coefficient of the next term is 4. The coefficient on this term is negative. It's actually negative 2. The coefficient of negative 5 is just negative 5. And what's the coefficient on just x? Well, we could write a little 1 right in front of x and multiply it by that x. So our coefficient here is actually considered to be 1. Of course, typically we don't write that 1 because it's unnecessary. And of course, our polynomial has variables. In this case, we just have one variable, and it's x in our polynomial. It's very possible that we might have multiple variables in a polynomial. For example, if I threw a y in there, that would be a two-variable polynomial. But in this class, we mostly just consider polynomials that have one variable. On every one of these variables is a power. The power on x in our first term is 3. The power on x in our next term is 5. The power on x here is 2. What's the power on x in negative 5? Well, again, we don't write it in because it's unnecessary, but you could consider 5 to be 5 times x to the 0 power. X to the 0 power, of course, in previous videos we learned is just 1. So we actually consider our power on this term to be 0. And the power on the term that's just x, again, we could have a power of 1 here. X is the same thing as x to the first power. So we just consider the power on that term to be 1. Another piece of vocabulary here, the degree of a polynomial is the highest power on the variable, in this case x. So the question is, what is the highest power on x? So we can just look at this list here, and the highest power that we have is 5. So the degree of this polynomial is 5. And that leads us to another piece of vocabulary. The leading term is the term that has the highest power on it. So the leading term in this case is 4x to the fifth. And one more vocabulary word here, the leading coefficient is the coefficient on the leading term, which would just be 4, of course. And I should say that in this example I used the word powers to describe obviously these powers on x. Those can also be called exponents, as we learned in previous videos. Okay, let's look at another example. Alright, here's an example of another polynomial. It starts with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms. But there's a difference between this polynomial and the one before it, because you'll notice there are two terms here, 5x squared and 4x squared, that have the same variable and the same exponent. Because these two terms have the same variable and same exponent, they're called like terms. There are two other like terms in this polynomial. 3x cubed and negative x cubed also have the same variable and they have the same exponent on that variable. So these two are considered like terms as well. The cool thing about like terms is that they can be combined into one. 5x squared and plus 4x squared can be combined into 9x squared. Obviously just by adding 5 plus 4. Likewise, 3x cubed minus, and that's a 1x cubed, can be combined into one term just by subtracting 3 minus 1, their coefficients. That's going to give us a plus 2. X cubed is our second term. And in this example, 1 does not have a like term. 1 is the loneliest number. So it can't combine with any other terms, and it just stays 1. So our polynomial in this case turns out to be, and I'm going to rewrite it, 2x cubed plus 9x squared plus 1. The most common way to write any polynomial is to write it in order of decreasing powers on x. So the x cubed would come first, the x squared would come second. If there was an x term, it would come third, and in this case there's a constant term that comes last. So we were left with a polynomial that has 1, 2, 3 terms, and any polynomial that has 3 terms in it can be called a trinomial. And while a polynomial with 3 terms is called a trinomial, a polynomial with 2 terms is called a binomial. An example of that might be something like x plus 5 or x squared minus x or something like that. Those have 2 terms, so they're called binomials. A polynomial with 1 term is called a monomial. An example of a monomial would be 5x cubed, or just 1, or even negative 12xy squared, or something like that. Those all have 1 term, so those would be considered to be monomials. Anytime you have a polynomial with more than 3 terms, it doesn't really have any special name. Now that we know about like terms, let's try adding these 2 polynomials. The key to adding these 2 polynomials is finding the like terms. Let's start with the highest power terms. Let's start with the x cubed terms in this example. I see 2x cubed plus a negative x cubed. That's a 2x cubed minus 1x cubed. And that's just going to leave us with 2 minus 1 is 1x cubed. Let's go to the next terms. Let's go to the x squared terms. I see a 5x squared plus a 2x squared. That's going to leave us with 7x squared. Now let's look at the x terms. I see a negative x plus a 1/2 x. The way to combine these terms is to consider the coefficient to actually be a negative 1, because we have a negative 1x here. So how do we combine negative 1x plus 1/2 x? Well, the key is to look at the coefficients. You do negative 1 plus 1/2. What is negative 1 plus 1/2? You have to add those fractions, so go back to the videos on adding fractions. And if you do it correctly, you should get the coefficient is negative 1/2. So combining those 2 terms leaves you with a negative 1/2 x. What terms do we have left? We just have the constant terms left. The terms with no x's at all, just numbers. We have 1 plus positive 7. That's a plus 8, and that is how we add polynomials. Let's do the same thing with the same 2 polynomials, except let's subtract them this time. Let's subtract these 2 polynomials. Well, it's really the same process as before. We're finding our like terms, like 2x cubed and the negative x cubed, except instead of adding them like we did in the previous example, we're actually going to subtract them. So most people actually find it easier to rewrite this polynomial first. I'm going to do that. I'm going to copy down the first polynomial, 2x cubed plus 5x squared minus x plus 1. When it comes to the polynomial that's being subtracted, what we can do is we can actually do what we call distribute that negative sign. That means we just take this minus sign and we put it on every single term inside the parentheses after it. So the way that looks is we put the negative on the 2x squared. If we put a negative on a negative x cubed, that actually changes it into a plus x cubed. We put the negative on the 7, and we put the negative on the 1/2 x. So there, we've rewritten this subtraction of polynomials to make our lives a little bit easier. Now let's find those like terms. Let's start with x cubed. We have 2x cubed plus x cubed. That's going to give us 3x cubed because we had a 2 plus a 1. The x squared terms, we have 5x squared minus 2x squared. 5 minus 2 is just, again, a 3. So our second term is 3x squared. Now let's look at the x terms. I see a minus x and a minus 1/2 x. Well, again, we consider this coefficient in front of the x to be a 1, and we end up having to do the subtraction, negative 1 minus 1/2. If you do that subtraction correctly, you'll get negative 3/2. So our x term turns out to be negative 3/2 x. And our 2 constant terms, as we call them, are 1 and negative 7. That's just going to be a negative 6. So that's a quick example of how to add and subtract polynomials. Let's get you to a video quiz. Okay, here's your video quiz. Add and subtract the 2 polynomials below. And the 2 polynomials have 4 terms each. We have 5x to the 4th minus 9x squared plus 3x minus 10. And we have 4x to the 4th plus 3x cubed minus 1/2 x plus 7. Keep your eye on the powers. Make sure that you're combining like terms correctly. You want to add these two things together, and we want to subtract the two, just like we did in the previous example. Good luck, and I'll see you in class.